Hello, and welcome to a video lecture for Mr. Mosier's 8th grade American History class. Today's topic is on the Cold War, looking at the culture revolutions of the 1950s and the 1960s. Our textbook reading that goes along well with this particular video lecture is pages 858 to 861, The Nation Prospers, The Escalation in Vietnam, 904 to 905, and The End of the War, pages 908 to 913. Our guiding questions for today are: how was the nation's economy during the 1950s? Who were the baby boomers? How was American pop culture dominated by rock and roll, movies, and television? Why was the country so divided in the 1960s? What is meant by counterculture? What was the motto of the hippies? What was Woodstock? And why was there such a strong anti-Vietnam War movement in the 1960s? And what's the difference between the hawks and the doves? I have here kind of a cross-section of 1950s culture. Take a moment here and see how many of these you can identify on this screen. Feel free to pause the video at this time. I hope that you were able to identify a few of these pictures. You might have recognized Elvis Presley. You might have recognized the television in the family home, the small black and white TV. You might have recognized the teenagers dancing. This was a sock hop. You might have recognized the woman in a poodle skirt. You also might have noticed the guy in the biker jacket. This is Marlon Brando in a very classic 1950s movie. You might have recognized the title for the I Love Lucy, which was a very famous television show in the 1950s. And you might have recognized the teenagers sharing a milkshake or a malt at a local 50s diner in the 1950s here. In the 1950s, saw a tremendous economic boom brought on from the end of World War II and the fact that America was very poised to have the opportunities to grow economically. Most of Europe had been destroyed as a result of World War II. Most of Asia also suffered tremendous destruction from World War II. Our factories that produced the weapons that win World War II were now poised to produce the consumer goods like cars and television and refrigerators for not just the American public, but also for a world trade, which created this economic boom, opportunities, and jobs. We also will see that American veterans who served in World War II will also be given the opportunity to improve their education and receive a college tuition paid for by the GI Bill. This is going to help many Americans go from the low-skill factory assembly line workers to more management-type positions that were a little higher paying of jobs that were able to support a family on a one-person income. This creates very traditional family units where you have families being able to support themselves off of one person's income, which is typically the man in the family, allowing the woman to stay at home to help take care of the kids. In the 1950s, we also will see the mass migration of people from the cities into the suburbs in the western parts of the city, and the rise of suburbia and suburbia culture, as the men will go to work and commute by traveling in their cars, and you'll see, of course, the families, units staying in these very similar forms of housing to creating these very distinctive, unique 1950s communities. We also will find in the 1950s a large population boom known as the baby boom, where 79 million babies were born. A baby was believed to have been born every 10 seconds in the 1950s, a rapid increase in population. Because of the 1950s culture, we see things like television and movies and rock and roll music really beginning to take shape in the 1950s. Television becomes a unifying force in the 1950s as more and more families are having opportunities to watch television programming and national news and watching similar kinds of programs like TV shows I Love Lucy or Leave It to Beaver that reinforce the views of this very traditional family unit. Of course, the teenagers of the 1950s will be exposed to drive-in movie theaters and, of course, will be exposed to rock and roll music from musicians like Elvis Presley. Now, these baby boomers born in the 1950s and grew up in the 1950s, by the time they become teenagers in the 1960s, they begin to become a little bit more rebellious. And there are some things that are happening in American culture that begins to shape as a result of these turbulent times of the 1960s. The 1960s will see a country deeply divided by the war in Vietnam. Because of the U.S. draft, many of these baby boomers were now being drafted into military service. And this war, they begin to question the merits of the containment policy of stopping the spread of communism, if this was really their rights and their duty to go to Vietnam to get involved in the Vietnam War to stop the spread of communism. We also will see a country more deeply divided on social issues, such as equal rights for women and equal rights for African Americans. We call this generation of baby boomers the counterculture. And the counterculture really begins to challenge what their parents had created in the 1950s, this suburban, traditional family, nuclear family with a father, a mother, a dad who goes to work, a mom who stays at home. These teenagers really begin challenging those traditional values. Counter means to run against. So the counterculture was the baby boomers' efforts, that generation's efforts, to begin to really challenge what they wanted to shape American culture. They had seen problems in our culture that they thought their generation could solve and fix. They really challenged these American values and the sources of authority and who had the right to dictate, who had the say in American society. They were typically more champions for equal rights for African Americans and for women. This is coming in the heels of the civil rights movement, which we'll be looking at and addressing in some other lecture videos coming out later. And so we see this idea of equality, and the other big factor that drives them is this fears of the Vietnam War, that you've got 50,000 Americans being killed in the Vietnam conflict. Many of these are baby boomers, and the baby boomers begin to challenge the notion of why we are fighting in Vietnam. We also see the formation of the hippie movement. The hippie movements, or the hippies, wanted a complete dropping out of those traditional values that their parents had created. The hippies dropped out of school. They didn't work. They lived in communities. There they shared resources. In a lot of ways, they shared very many communist viewpoints about the sharing of resources. They dreamed of peace and love and freedom, and their motto was really kind of a do your own thing. Don't be told what to do, how to live, but do the things that you feel will make you happy and will bring you to that state of happiness. Probably the largest cultural event of the 1960s, of that baby boom generation, was Woodstock, which was a music festival in upstate New York near a place called Woodstock. It was from August 15th to the 18th in 1969. 500,000 baby boomers will show up to this rock concert, many of whom didn't have tickets. They'll just storm the fences and come to this concert to give them a chance to be with other baby boomers who shared a lot of the values of that counterculture movement. It lasted 3 days. It was 3 rainy days. They listened to 32 music groups that shared their beliefs of equality and the views of ending the Vietnam War. Of all the events of the 1960s, probably the largest one that shaped the attitudes of a lot of baby boomers was the anti-war movement. Many Americans believed that it was not America's role to police the world, that America had their own issues and own problems that they needed to work through and solve. And so we see a large number of baby boomers who are protesting. A lot of these are on college campuses. You gotta think these are the baby boomers who are over 18, that age where they can be drafted. Many men will burn their draft cards and will flee to Canada to avoid the war and to avoid prosecution for refusing to go to the armed services after being drafted. Lots of these protests were peaceful. Some will turn very violent. Many of these protests will turn violent. The most famous of these is the Kent State protest that occurs on May 4th, 1970, where during the protest, National Guardsmen will open fire and kill 4 protesters at that university. This division between those who supported the Vietnam War and those that opposed the Vietnam War create 2 distinctive camps of beliefs. You have the doves. The dove is the symbol of peace. The Americans who opposed the war effort become known as the doves. They really felt that America should not be involved in the affairs of other countries, that Vietnam was not the country's problems. And then you had Americans that supported the war effort, and those were known as the Hawks, who believed that there was a important battle of ideology between capitalism versus communism, American values of democracy versus communism and dictatorship and authority of these very strict dictatorship regimes of communism in the Soviet Union. And so that the Vietnam War was that domino theory. If we don't stop Vietnam from becoming a communist nation, it'll cause all that region to fall to communism, and America is the only country that can stand up and stop that from happening. So you see this very deeply division of the country between the war, between those that support it and those that did not support it. And this really shapes a lot of the attitudes of the baby boomers generation in the 1960s as those who find themselves on two very distinctive lines between those that support the war and those that don't support the war. So we see in the 1950s and 1960s the emergence of a lot of different pop culture, a lot of the culture wars that we see today between more traditional values versus more of a liberal mindset of freedom, equality, gay rights, civil rights. That begins to take shape in the 1960s. As always, thank you so much for listening. If you have questions, please make sure you come talk to